They mocked the veteran for the strange thing he was building with his loyal dog, calling it a madman's bunker carved into the Wyoming granite. But one day, his dog, Echo, refused to leave a blank section of the cavern wall, as if it sensed something hidden deep within the stone. And when the 100-year blizzard the town never saw coming finally struck, the place they all laughed at became the only thing keeping every last one of them alive. What the dog uncovered that day, and what the man knew long before anyone else, is a story about how the quietest people are sometimes placed on this earth to save it. Dan Reynolds, 48 years old and carrying the kind of stillness that only comes from seeing the world's loudest places, had chosen the west face of Granite Peak for a reason. The land was unforgiving, but it was honest. With him always was Echo, a German shepherd whose sable coat was the color of the dry earth and whose eyes held the same watchful patience as the man himself. Together, they worked. Not with dynamite and heavy machinery, but with the steady persistence of hammer, chisel, and time. For 2 years, they had been carving a life from the mountain. The entrance was a heavy, insulated steel door, set deep into the rock and painted a dull gray that almost vanished in the evening shadows. It opened into a space that was less a bunker and more a cathedral of self-reliance. The main chamber was 50 feet long and 20 wide, the walls rough-hewn but clean, the ceiling arching a dozen feet overhead. There was no damp chill. The air was dry and, impossibly, warm. Dan had spent a year sinking a geothermal loop deep into the mountain's core, a silent, ceaseless source of heat that kept the stone itself at a constant 60 degrees. His life ran on systems, each one a testament to foresight. A clever series of baffles and a solar-powered fan, its panel mounted high on the sun-facing cliff, drew in fresh air and circulated it without a sound. Water came from a deep cistern he'd lined with concrete, fed by snowmelt that trickled through a complex filtration system of sand and charcoal he'd designed himself. In the rearmost chamber, under the soft, purple-white glow of full-spectrum lamps, was his garden. Rows of lettuce, kale, tomatoes, and beans grew in nutrient-rich water, a splash of impossible green deep in the belly of the mountain. This was his food, his oxygen, his quiet rebellion against the whims of the outside world. Echo would lie for hours in the garden chamber, his head on his paws, watching Dan tend to the plants with a gardener's gentle hands. The dog was more than a companion. He was a partner, a silent second opinion. He rarely barked, and every movement had purpose. He was the guardian of this quiet, ordered world. On a small, hand-carved shelf near Dan's cot sat a single worn photograph in a simple pine frame. A smiling woman with Dan's eyes, her hand resting on the shoulder of a young boy. It was the only piece of his past he allowed to occupy the present, a silent question and a solemn vow all in one. Deeper in, past the garden, was the end of his work, a solid wall of granite, the terminus. He had plans for it someday, but for now, it was just the final, unyielding boundary of his strange and meticulous kingdom. The town of Granite Falls sat in the valley below, a place that measured a man by the size of his ranch or the volume of his voice. Dan Reynolds had neither, and so they measured him by his strangeness. The hub of all town opinion was the Rusty Spur, a bar run by a man named Hank Barlow. Hank was 50, with a flushed, perpetually smiling face and a booming laugh that filled every corner of his establishment. He was the one who'd christened Dan's project the Mole Hole. The name stuck. On any given Tuesday, you could hear him holding court. "Saw the mole man in town today," he'd announce to the bar, polishing a glass. "Stocking up on lamp oil and dried beans? Reckon he's getting ready for the end of the world again?" The laughter that followed was easy and familiar. A couple of ranchers, the Clanton brothers, would chuckle into their beers. A failed real estate developer named Morris, who'd lost a fortune betting on a ski resort that never materialized, would smirk and add, "Man's got more screws loose than my old Ford. A grown man playing in a cave with his dog. Dan heard the whispers when he came to town for supplies. He felt the eyes on his back and as he loaded bags of fertilizer and spare parts for his water pump into his old truck. He never rose to the bait. He would simply nod politely, pay for his goods, and leave. His face was a calm mask that betrayed nothing. He didn't come back to this valley for their approval. He didn't owe them an explanation. There was only one person in town who didn't join in. Sarah Jenkins ran the general store, a widow in her late 40s with kind, tired eyes that had seen a real loss and knew its weight. She had lost her husband to a sudden heart attack 5 years prior, and she understood that the world could break without warning. She always had Dan's order ready for him, and she'd ask about Echo, never about the shelter. "Looks like you're reinforcing that door seal," she'd say, noting the industrial-grade rubber stripping in his cart. "Good idea. The wind on that west face can peel paint off a truck." Dan would offer a rare, small smile. Something like that. He'd pay, and she'd watch him go, a quiet respect in her gaze. She didn't understand what he was building, not really, but she understood the impulse to build something solid against the world. Back on the mountain, the town's laughter would fade with the engine's hum. Dan would unload his supplies, Echo at his heels, and the heavy steel door would swing shut, closing out the noise, the judgment, the entire world. He'd run a hand over the cool, solid granite of the back wall, the place his work had stopped. The photograph on his shelf seemed to watch him, a silent reminder of why he traded comfort for labor and company for solitude. The reason for the work ran deeper than the geothermal loop. Dan had spent 20 years as a Navy SEAL, operating in the planet's most hostile environments, from the frozen dark of the Arctic Circle to the crushing heat of the deep desert. He was a master of survival, a man trained to see the flaw in any system, the weakness in any defense. But it wasn't the missions he carried with him. It was the one catastrophic failure. A training exercise in Alaska, a blizzard that came out of nowhere, a whiteout so complete it erased the world. A new piece of equipment, a state-of-the-art GPS beacon, had failed in the extreme cold. They were blind. A young SEAL, barely 21, had died of exposure not 50 yards from their emergency shelter, lost in the swirling chaos. Dan had been the team leader. He never forgave the cold, the equipment, or himself. He carried the weight of that boy's life every day. His father, a stoic Wyoming rancher, had understood the unforgiving nature of the world. He'd never been a soldier, but he'd survived the land. "You don't prepare for the storm you see coming, Danny," he'd say, mending a fence. "You prepare for the one you don't." After his father passed, Dan found an old, leather-bound journal in his footlocker. On the first page, his father had written a simple note. "Found a good place up on the west face. Warm air comes from the rock. If things ever get hard, trust the mountain. And trust your dog." It was this inheritance, a ghost of failure and a father's quiet wisdom, that drove him to chisel away at the granite. One afternoon, months into the project, Echo began to act strangely. He stopped his usual patrol of the chamber and stood, fixed, before the solid back wall. He didn't bark or scratch, but a low, persistent whine rumbled in his chest. His body was rigid, his ears pricked forward, his nose pressed against a section of rock that looked no different from the rest. Dan called him, but the dog wouldn't move. For 3 days, Echo kept his vigil. He would only leave the spot to eat or drink, and then he would immediately return. Dan had learned in the service that the most sensitive instruments weren't made of circuits and wires. They were the instincts of a well-trained animal. On the 4th day, he picked up his heaviest sledgehammer and a star drill. Trust the mountain, and trust your dog. He began to work, the rhythmic clang of steel on steel echoing in the chamber. For hours he hammered, chipping away at the granite. Finally, with a deep groan, a section of the rock fractured and fell away, revealing not a tunnel, but a small natural cavern behind it. A wave of clean, dry heat washed over him, smelling of deep earth and warm stone. In the center of the small chamber, a fissure in the floor breathed a steady, gentle warmth, a geothermal vent, and from a crack in the ceiling above it, a slow, constant drip of pure, clear water collected in a small pool. He had found the mountain's heart. With the discovery of the geothermal vent and the hidden spring, Dan's work took on a new purpose. It was no longer just about survival, it was about sustainability. He spent the next year transforming the shelter, running copper tubing through the warm cavern to create a passive heating system for the entire space and a source of limitless hot water. He channeled the spring into his cistern, ensuring a supply that was constantly replenished, pure and cold. The hydroponic garden, now fed by this living water and warmed by the earth's own heat, flourished. His strange project had become a self-contained, living ecosystem. As that year's summer faded into a short, brittle autumn, Dan began to read the signs the valley ignored. The elk herds, usually content in the high country until the first deep snows, were already moving down onto the plains, their movements hurried and nervous. The squirrels in the pines around his shelter were frantic, their chattering incessant as they stripped every cone, hoarding with a desperate intensity he'd never seen before. The air itself felt different. It was thin and still, holding a strange metallic taste. The sky, which should have been a sharp Wyoming blue, was veiled in a high, milky haze that muted the sun. And the pressure, he felt it in his bones, a slow, heavy descent that was confirmed by the old barometer his father had left him. The needle had been creeping downward for a week, a slow, inexorable march toward a historic low. He said nothing to the town. They wouldn't have listened. Instead, he intensified his preparations. He doubled his stores of dry goods not out of fear, but out of discipline. He spent a week meticulously checking every seal on the door and the ventilation ports, replacing gaskets and caulking invisible cracks. He harvested everything from the garden that was ripe, spending his evenings canning tomatoes and pickling beans under the steady glow of his lamps. Echo, too, sensed the coming shift. The dog grew restless, pacing the main chamber and often stopping at the door, his nose pressed to the narrow gap at the bottom, whining softly at the changing air outside. He was no longer the calm, patient guardian. He was a sentinel on alert. One afternoon, on his last supply run, Dan saw Old Man Hemlock, a rancher who lived on the far edge of the valley and rarely spoke to anyone. Hemlock was loading his truck with more propane tanks than a man could use in 2 winters. He caught Dan's eye and gave a curt, meaningful nod toward the hazy sky. "That sky's telling a story," Hemlock said, his voice a dry rasp. "Ain't heard this one since the big blow of '78. That one buried fences up to the top wire." Dan just nodded back. "Stay safe, Arthur." "You too, son," the old man replied, and the 2 men, separated by a generation but united by their ability to listen to the land, went their separate ways. Dan drove back up the mountain, the weight of what was coming settling over him not as fear, but as a quiet, profound sense of readiness. The first flakes fell just after dusk, soft and aimless, dusting the pines with a delicate coat of white. The town barely noticed. It was Wyoming. Snow was a fact of life. But by midnight, the character of the storm had changed. The gentle flakes had been replaced by a hard, driving onslaught, and the wind had begun to howl, a low, predatory moan that rattled windows in their frames. The temperature, which had been hovering around freezing, began a freefall. By dawn, Granite Falls had vanished. The world outside Dan's steel door was an indistinct, roaring whiteness. The wind shrieked like a living thing, scouring the mountainside with ice crystals. Inside, the shelter was an island of profound calm. The The geothermal heat kept the air a comfortable 65 degrees. The only sounds were the soft hum of the ventilation fan and the gentle trickle of water into the cistern. Echo lay by the door, his head on his paws, listening to the fury his master had so calmly prepared for. In the valley, the town's fragile systems were breaking. The first to go was the power. Just before 2 a.m., a series of sharp cracks echoed across the valley as overburdened power lines, heavy with ice and lashed by the wind, snapped. The town was plunged into a deep, primal darkness. Backup generators sputtered to life at the town hall and the clinic, their engines a frail reassurance against the storm. But most homes went cold and black. Next was the heat. Propane tanks, the lifeblood of rural Wyoming homes, began to fail as regulators froze solid in the plummeting temperatures. Pipes burst with sounds like gunshots. Families huddled around wood stoves, feeding them with a growing sense of dread as they watched their precious woodpiles, meant to last a month, dwindle in a single night. The storm was not just a blizzard, it was a siege. Snow began to drift, burying roads, cars, and the first floors of houses. The wind, now gusting over 80 miles per hour, tore shingles from roofs and shattered windows. The generators at the town hall and clinic finally gave out, their fuel lines freezing. Granite Falls was cut off, cold and terrified. Dan Reynolds moved through his routine with the unhurried calm of a monk. He tended his garden, checked his systems, and made a pot of coffee, the rich smell filling the warm air. He knew what was happening in the valley below. He could picture the fear, the creeping cold, the dawning realization that the world they knew had failed them. He sat at his small wooden table, a mug warming his hands, and listened to the storm rage against the mountain. He had not built this place out of fear of the world, but out of respect for it. And now, the world was reminding everyone of the bill that always comes due. The first knock was faint, almost lost in the roar of the wind. It was the afternoon of the second day. Echo's head shot up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Dan quieted him with a hand on his back and went to the door. He pulled back the heavy bolts and cracked it open. A blast of frigid, snow-laden air tore into the entrance. Huddled outside were the Millers, his nearest neighbors from a mile down the slope. Tom Miller's face was a mask of ice. His wife, Jenny, was clutching their two small children, who were wrapped in every blanket they owned and shivering violently. Dan. Tom's voice was a choked whisper. Our propane's gone, the wood's out. We're freezing. Dan didn't hesitate. He simply swung the door wide. Get inside. He led them into the warmth, the two children staring with wide, unbelieving eyes at the glowing garden and the dry, warm air. Jenny Miller burst into tears of sheer relief. Dan settled them in a corner with thick wool blankets and gave them each a bowl of hot tomato soup from a pot simmering on his small stove. He said nothing of the mockery, nothing of the warnings they'd ignored. He simply gave them shelter. Word must have spread through some brief, miraculous flicker of cell service. Or maybe it was just desperation leading them to the one place they knew was different. A few hours later, another group arrived. The Clanton brothers, the ranchers who had laughed so loudly in Hank's bar, now humbled and half-frozen, their bravado stripped away by the cold. They brought with them old Mrs. Gable, the town's librarian, who had collapsed in the snow trying to get to her woodshed. Dan let them in, too. His shelter, designed for one man and his dog, was now holding a dozen people. The systems held. The air recyclers hummed a little louder, but the air remained fresh. The warmth from the vent was unwavering. The garden provided. Throughout the night and into the third day, they kept coming. The family that ran the diner, the town's only mechanic. Each time Dan would open the door and let them in, his calm presence a steady anchor in their terror. Echo moved among the newcomers, initially watchful, but then seeming to sense their desperation. He nudged his head into a crying child's hand and lay his warm body next to old Mrs. Gable, a silent, furry guardian. The last to arrive was Hank Barlow. He stumbled up the path alone, his face gaunt, his booming voice reduced to a ragged rasp. He had stayed in his bar until the last of the whiskey was gone and the cold had begun to seep into his bones. He looked utterly broken. He stood in the entrance, dripping snow onto the stone floor, unable to meet Dan's eyes. He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, all of them safe, all of them warm. "Dan," he croaked, shamefaced. Dan simply walked over, took the empty bottle from Hank's hand, and replaced it with a steaming mug of coffee. "Drink this, Hank," he said quietly. "You're safe now." For 4 more days, the blizzard raged. The world outside was a maelstrom of white, but inside the mountain, a new community was being forged in the gentle geothermal warmth. The shelter, which had been an object of ridicule, became a sanctuary. The initial shock and fear among the townspeople gave way to a quiet, collaborative routine. There were nearly 30 of them now, a cross-section of granite falls huddled in the heart of the mountain. They were not idle guests. Without being asked, they began to contribute. The mechanic, a man named Dave, noticed a slight stutter in the ventilation fan, and using a small toolkit Dan provided, spent an hour meticulously cleaning and oiling it until it ran silently again. Sarah Jenkins, the store owner, who had arrived with a small group from the center of town, took charge of the hydroponic garden. She organized a small team to help her harvest the greens and tomatoes, her practical, no-nonsense manner bringing a sense of order to their small, shared world. Children, at first frightened and silent, began to play quietly in a corner, their games illuminated by the soft glow of the grow lamps. The Clanton brothers, big men used to open spaces, proved surprisingly adept at organizing sleeping shifts and rationing the canned goods Dan had stored, ensuring everyone had enough. But the most profound transformation was in Hank Barlow. The shame that had stooped his shoulders on arrival slowly burned away, replaced by a fierce, quiet determination. He became Dan's unofficial second-in-command. He organized work details to keep the common areas clean, helped portion out meals, and spent hours just sitting with Mrs. Gable, listening to her stories. He seemed driven by a need to atone for every joke, every dismissive wave of his hand. On the 5th day, he found Dan checking the filtration system for the cistern. The shelter was quiet, the only sounds the hum of the fan and the soft murmurs of a sleeping child. "Dan," Hank began, his voice low, "I've been a fool, a loud, ignorant fool. What you built here, it's not a mole hole, it's an ark." He looked at the rows of thriving plants, at the steady trickle of clean water. "I was wrong about you, about all of it. I'm sorry." Dan stopped what he was doing and looked at him. There was no triumph in his eyes, no hint of "I told you so." There was only a quiet acceptance. He wiped his hands on a rag and nodded once. "We're all just trying to get through the winter, Hank." It was all the absolution Hank needed. In that moment, a bond was formed, not of words, but of shared work and mutual respect, deep in the warm, living stone. When the sun finally broke through on the 8th day, it illuminated a world remade in white and silence. The wind had died, and the sky was a piercing, painful blue. From the door of the shelter, the people of Granite Falls looked out upon their buried town. The damage was immense. Roofs had collapsed, buildings were buried in drifts 20 feet deep, and the silence was absolute. But as they took stock, a miracle became clear. Not a single life had been lost. Every man, woman, and child was accounted for, safe within the stone walls of Dan's refuge. The story of their survival became the new legend of Granite Falls. In the weeks of digging out that followed, the town changed. The mockery was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding respect for the quiet man on the mountain. They no longer called his home the mole hole. They called it the refuge. The lessons of the great blizzard were not forgotten. Led by a humbled and profoundly changed Hank Barlow, the town council began to prepare. They didn't mock foresight anymore. They embraced it. They used town funds to bury the power lines. They established community supply caches, modeled on Dan's own meticulous system. They helped families reinforce their homes and install secondary non-electric heating sources. Dan, once the town outcast, became its quiet teacher. Young people would make the trek up the mountain not to stare, but to learn. He showed them how to build a water filter, how to graft tomato plants, how to read the sky for a coming storm. He never lectured. He simply showed them, his actions a more powerful lesson than any words. Years passed. The world outside changed, but in Granite Falls, the memory of that winter remained a defining part of their identity. Dan grew older, the lines on his face deepening, his hair turning the color of snow. Echo, his loyal partner, grew gray around the muzzle and slow in his step, content to spend his days sleeping in the warm, green light of the garden. The town erected a simple, hand-carved wooden sign at the bottom of the path leading up to his shelter. It didn't say Dan Reynolds. It just said, "The Reynolds Refuge. Established year of the Great Storm." Dan had found what he hadn't even known he was looking for. Not just safety, but a home. Not just solitude, but a community. He had prepared for the worst, and in doing so, had created the very best of what people could be. He had fulfilled his father's quiet legacy, and at last made peace with the ghost of a young seal lost to the cold so long ago. The strange choice of a man the town misunderstood had become the one thing that saved the whole valley.